It's October 31st, 1974. It was a rainy night in suburban Texas, but that did not stop the costumed children who had been looking forward to this night all year long. Laughter echoed through the streets, and entire families went door to door as they always did. But this time, something dark hid behind the laughter and candy. Something that would change Halloween forever. Hey y'all, I'm Christina, and you're listening to History and Hearsay. Now, today's story is a very famous case. So for those of you who follow true crime, this one is definitely going to already be familiar to you. And I even mentioned this case in one of my very first videos that I did on this channel 3 years ago. But I hope even if you are familiar with the story that you'll still enjoy it and maybe even learn something new about the case. The O'Briens were a family of 4 living in Deer Park, Texas. The father, Ronald, worked at Texas State Optical in the Houston area. He was also a deacon at the Second Baptist Church. Not to be confused with the First Baptist Church. They got their second. He also sang in the choir and ran the local bus program for the church. On October 31st, 1974, Ronald and his wife Daneen and their 2 children, 8-year-old Timothy and 5-year-old Elizabeth, went over to their friends, the Bates family's home for dinner. Now, while the O'Briens lived in Deer Park, the Bates lived in a more upscale neighborhood in Pasadena, Texas, and their neighborhood was known to be a Halloween hotspot. So the 2 fathers, Ronald and Jim, decided to go ahead and take the children out for trick-or-treating. Ronald brought both of his children while Jim brought his young son to complete the group, and the 5 of them began roaming the neighborhood, ringing doorbells and collecting candy. As they approached one particular house, they noticed that its lights were off, which of course, this is the age-old symbol that this neighbor is not participating in the night's festivities for some reason. But this was ignored by the children, who were much too excited about collecting candy and began banging on the door. However, when no one immediately answered, the impatient children ran ahead to the next house. Jim followed the children, with Ronald lagging behind. When Ronald caught up to the group a few moments later, he had good news. Someone had come to the door after all. Ronald was holding 5 giant 21-inch Pixie Stix. "You must have some rich neighbors," he told Jim as he passed the candy out to the kids. He gave 1 to each of his children and 2 to Jim's son so that he could give the other one to his sibling when they got back home. When they passed a young boy that Ronald recognized from church, he gave the 5th and final Pixie Stick to him. When they arrived home, Ronald told his children that they could each have 1 treat before heading to bed. Timothy pulled out a sucker, but Ronald informed him that he didn't have time to eat a sucker before bed, and he should try a Pixie Stick instead. Timothy had a difficult time opening the package, so Ronald helped him. Timothy then struggled to get the candy out of the tube, so Ronald rolled the tube between his hands and then handed it back to his son. As soon as the powder poured into his mouth, Timothy complained, "Oh, Daddy, that's bitter." Ronald then gave him some Kool-Aid to wash it down, and just moments later, Timothy began experiencing severe stomach cramps and ran to the bathroom as he became violently ill. Ronald held his son as he convulsed and then went limp. Ronald called an ambulance and held his son until first responders arrived. Timothy was rushed to the hospital, but died on the way there less than an hour after eating his Pixie Stick. Ronald informed the police that he had gotten 5 Pixie Stix, and they rushed to retrieve the remaining candy from the other children. It didn't take long for them to recover all but 1 of the remaining Pixie Stix. Luckily, none of the other children had consumed the candy. Now, one of the kids had showed his mother the Pixie Stick. She told him that he couldn't have it that night, but that she would allow him to eat it tomorrow afternoon after school. Can you imagine? I mean, that was definitely the day to be the strict mom for sure. The parents of the 5th child became hysterical when they could not locate the Pixie Stick after they were notified. When they rushed up to their son's room, they found him sound asleep, holding the unopened Pixie Stick. He had attempted to open and eat the candy, but his little hands were not strong enough to undo the staple that the poisoner had placed to reseal the package. The police now had all 5 Pixie Stix to run tests on. Now, Ronald O'Brien was said to have had an amazing singing voice, and when he sang at the church service after his son's death, he performed a moving rendition of the hymn Blessed Assurance. Now, when he got to the part that says, "This is my story, this is my song," he changed the words to, "This is Tim's story, this is Tim's song." It's said that there was not a dry eye left in that church. The Pasadena Police Department didn't waste any time with this case, and when they called the Harris County Prosecutor's Office to report the death of an 8-year-old boy, prosecutor Mike Hinton went to view the body, and he noticed something peculiar. He asked the medical examiner why the young boy's breath smelled the way it did. There was a strong scent of almonds coming from the boy's mouth. The doctor said, "It's cyanide." An autopsy would later confirm that Timothy's Pixie Stick had been laced with potassium cyanide, and the amount he consumed was enough to kill 2 adults. Now, typically, if you're poisoned with cyanide, you have about a 30-minute window to get some help, but unfortunately for Timothy, the amount that he took, there was really no saving him, even if they had gotten to him sooner. Now, the O'Brien family was well known in the area they lived in, and word traveled fast. Terrified parents in the local area brought so much candy into the police station that they filled an entire squad room. However, no additional poison was found. Reporters stormed the area from as far away as London and Germany. Parents all across America tossed out their children's Halloween candy and vowed to never celebrate Halloween again. When police tested those remaining Pixie Stix, all 5 of those giant Pixie Stix were found to have been opened, the top 2 inches refilled with cyanide powder, and then resealed with a staple. They found enough cyanide in each stick to kill at least 3 to 4 adults. Police took Ronald around the neighborhood to retrace his steps, but he could not remember which house had given him the Pixie Stix. He said that a person had just emerged from the doorway and handed him the candy. It was dark and he couldn't see the person's face. Now, at first, police were not suspecting Ronald at all, but it turns out that he and Jim had only trick-or-treated 2 homes on 2 streets. And so police thought it was rather odd that Ronald couldn't remember which house it had been. In addition to that, none of the homes on those 2 streets had been passing out Pixie Stix on Halloween. Finally, on the 3rd time the police walked the neighborhood with Ronald, they were starting to get frustrated. They decided to take a more firm approach with him. And surprise, surprise, he remembered something. He pointed them towards a house. He says that he remembered the house, but claimed that the man had left his light off and simply stuck his arm out the door with the candy. So all that Ronald could say for sure was that it was a white male. So police knock on the door, but no one was home. Police were, of course, then able to determine that the home was owned by a Mr. Courtney Melvin and that he worked as an air traffic controller at William P. Hobby Airport in Houston. So the police tracked him down to his workplace and arrested him on the spot in front of all of his coworkers. Seemed like a quick end to a tragic story. Only Melvin had a very good alibi. He had been working that night, and there were at least 200 people who could confirm having seen him. He didn't arrive back home until 11 p.m. Now, his wife and his daughter had been handing out candy earlier that evening, but they had not been passing out Pixie Stix and had turned their lights out early when they ran out of candy. So, police turned their attention back to Ronald, and it didn't take long for them to find out that this guy might not be exactly as he seemed. Good old Ronald was having some money troubles. Not only was Ronald in debt up to his eyeballs with more than $100,000 in debt, which would be over $650,000 in today's money, but he also had a history of not being able to hold down a job for very long. His wife would later confirm that he had lost more than 20 jobs in the last several years. Now, depending on the source you read, some say that it was in the last 5 years, some say it was in the last 10, but either way, it was obvious that this guy had a bit of a hard time keeping a job. Police also found out that his current job at Texas State Optical has suspected him of stealing, and he was close to being fired. He hadn't made a car payment in months and months, and his car was about to be repossessed. He had also defaulted on several bank loans, and the family home was about to be foreclosed on. What police discovered next would turn out to be the nail in the coffin for Ronald. And that was that he had recently taken out life insurance policies on both of his children. He had taken out $10,000 on each child in January of 1974, and then he had taken out an additional $20,000 life insurance policy per child the month before in September. Now, he had initially talked about taking out life insurance policies on the kids because apparently it was something that was offered through his job, and his wife had told him that it seemed to be a waste of money, especially with the fact that the family was in such dire financial straits at that time. I mean, they were having a lot of trouble making ends meet, so those extra dollars going towards policies for children, which is something that most people would feel is unnecessary, was especially unnecessary for them. So when Ronald went back and got the second policies out on the children, he didn't mention it to his wife. And this was later confirmed by the insurance agent, who confirmed Mrs. O'Brien's statement that she did not know about the life insurance policies on the children, at least not the second ones. It wasn't clear if she knew that he had gone through with the first policies, but she certainly did not know that he had taken out those second policies. When police confronted Ronald with some of the information that they had discovered, he denied everything. He later admitted to purchasing the insurance policies, but still maintained his innocence in regards to the poisoning. However, police would then learn that the morning after Timothy's death, Ronald had already called the insurance company at 9 a.m., only like 11 hours after his son had died, to ask about the payout for the policies he had purchased on Timothy, which is just so sickening. I can't even imagine what his wife had to be feeling hearing all of this, which when the police did speak to Ronald's friends and neighbors about all of this stuff, they could not believe that he was a suspect. One person said they wouldn't believe it until they heard it from Ronald's own lips. Police also learned during the course of their investigation that Ronald had visited a chemical supply store in Houston in an attempt to purchase cyanide shortly before Halloween of 1974. But he had left without purchasing anything when he learned that the smallest amount available for purchase was 5 pounds. The clerk at the store couldn't say for sure who the man had been, but described the exact uniform that Ronald wore at Texas State Optical. Police were developing a theory that they felt was the obvious answer. Ronald had laced the candy with poison in order to kill his children and collect life insurance policy payouts. He had then passed out poisoned candy to other children in an attempt to cover up his crime. Police got a search warrant and found a pair of scissors in the O'Brien's house that had plastic residue attached to them, which was similar to the packaging on the cyanide-laced candy treats. According to some reports, there was also actual cyanide powder found on those scissors. Police also found a piece of paper that was with Ronald's adding machine where he had wrote down the amounts of all of his debts, and it added up to the amount that he would collect if he were to claim the insurance policies that he had taken out on both of his children. As the investigation continued, police discovered that Ronald was taking classes at a local community college and had reportedly asked the professor in class things like, what is more lethal, cyanide or another type of poison? And this caused investigators to wonder, why would someone ask that? Ronald was arrested and taken in for questioning on November 5th, 1974. When police shared the evidence against him with Ronald's wife, Daneen, she said, "Oh my God, no." She lowered her head and was visibly distraught. But when she was able to gather herself enough to talk is when she was able to tell police about how Ronald had had a hard time holding down a job. And she also said that he was known to exaggerate things and had an issue with overspending. She also said that he was in constant financial trouble and had previously collected on 2 insurance policies involving furniture that was destroyed in fires. Ronald was ultimately charged with the murder of his son and the attempted murder of the other children who he had given Pixie Stix to. His trial started in Houston on May 5th, 1975. Ronald, who maintained his innocence, entered a not guilty plea. His defense was that some untraceable boogeyman was the culprit. The age-old story of a sick individual who had used Halloween as a cover-up for their heinous crimes. Ronald was branded as the Candyman in the press during his trial, and his friends, family, and co-workers who had initially stood by his side when confronted with more and more evidence as it came to light, ultimately testified against him.
Most of today's testimony came from Jimmy Bates, a close friend of the O'Brien family. Bates said that before Halloween, O'Brien asked if he could bring his children over to trick-or-treat with the Bates children on Halloween night. Both families ate dinner together, and then the fathers took the children trick-or-treating. Bates said O'Brien went to one house where no one appeared to be home, and after the children had scampered ahead to the next house, O'Brien came off the front porch carrying the Pixie Stix. He gave the Pixie Stix to the children and then later took them back and said he wanted to stop at his car for a moment. Bates said when O'Brien came back into the Bates house, he returned the Pixie Stix to the children. Later that night, Timothy O'Brien died from eating a poisoned Pixie Stick.
A chemist who had been an acquaintance testified that in the summer of 1973, Ronald had asked him how much cyanide would be fatal. A chemical supply salesman testified that Ronald had inquired about how to purchase cyanide. I also read one article that said that Ronald had tried to imply to someone that he was getting the cyanide for work reasons, but of course that didn't add up. Friends and coworkers testified that in the months before Timothy's death, Ronald had showed an unusual interest in cyanide and spoke about how much it would take to kill a person. Daneen testified as to how her husband had asked her about how the insurance money should be spent before they had even held Timothy's funeral. Another relative testified how on the day of Timothy's funeral, Ronald had asked him if the insurance money should be spent to pay off his bills or if he should use it to buy a new house. Ronald's sister-in-law and brother-in-law testified that on the day of Timothy's funeral, Ronald spoke of using the money from the boys' insurance policy to take a long vacation and buy things. And there was even some evidence that he had made those plans despite the crippling amount of debt that he had. And several times during their cross-examinations, the Harris County District Attorney caught Ronald in a lie. When Ronald had gone out trick-or-treating with the kids, he had still been dressed in his lab coat. Now, some reports said that he was in like a raincoat, but there were a lot of reports I found that said he was still in his lab coat, which of course would have appeared to possibly have been a Halloween costume to anyone else who was walking around, but it would also have made it easy for him to conceal those giant Pixie Stix. And investigators believed that Ronald had simply hidden the Pixie Stix up the sleeve of his jacket until he was ready to use them. However, they were never able to pinpoint how he had gotten the cyanide. Even still, the circumstantial evidence and all of the eyewitness testimony was obviously very convincing. So on June 3rd, 1975, it took the jury just 46 minutes to find Ronald O'Brien guilty of one charge of capital murder and 4 counts of attempted murder. During the punishment phase of the trial, the DA asked for a death sentence because, as he put it, Ronald ought to be damned to hell. The DA went on to say, "It is the most despicable crime I have ever heard of, to take the life of your own flesh and blood for money." And so it only took an additional 71 minutes to condemn him to death. Ronald would be executed by electric chair. His wife divorced him after the conviction. Ronald, of course, continued to maintain his innocence and over the next several years appealed from the state courts all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, but they ultimately refused to review his case. On September 30th, in an act of poetic justice, State District Judge Michael T. McSpadden set an execution date for Ronald O'Brien of October 31st, 1982. Exactly 8 years after his disgusting, financially motivated crime. Judge McSpadden told Ronald, "I picked it for you especially." However, Ronald continued with his appeals and was able to get a stay of execution. This was one of 3 separate stays that he had won, as he continued to insist that he had absolutely nothing to do with this crime. Now, when Ronald was confronted by former neighbors and parents of his other would-be victims about why he had not made a bigger stink if he was innocent, he had simply said that he had written letters. And when he was asked why he had not reached out to them directly to proclaim his innocence, he said he didn't know what to say to them. Finally, in early 1984, Ronald had exhausted all of his appeals, and the so-called Candy Man, or the man who ruined Halloween as he had become known, had his final meal, which included a T-bone steak, medium to well done, French fries and ketchup, whole kernel corn, sweet peas, lettuce, and tomato salad with egg and French dressing, iced sweet tea, sweetener, saltines, Boston cream pie, and rolls. And when he was allowed to share his last words, he said, "What is about to transpire in a few moments is wrong. However, we as human beings do make mistakes and errors. This execution is one of those wrongs, yet doesn't mean our whole system of justice is wrong. Therefore, I would forgive all of those who have taken part in any way in my death. Also, to anyone I have offended in any way during my 39 years, I pray and ask your forgiveness, just as I forgive anyone who offended me in any way. And I pray and ask God's forgiveness for all of us, respectively, as human beings. To my loved ones, I extend my undying love. To those close to me, know in your hearts I love you one and all. God bless you all, and may God's best blessing be always yours." So, of course, as pretty much always, there were some people who believed Ronald's claims of innocence. However, his former wife, Daneen, told the Houston Chronicle he made his bed and now he is having to lie in it. I have no pity for him. So it's execution day, March 31st, 1984. It's nearly 10 years after the death of his son, and by this time, the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that the electric chair is a cruel and unusual punishment. So instead of that, Ronald O'Bryan was executed by lethal injection and pronounced dead at 12:48 a.m. Outside of the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville, a crowd of around 300 people had gathered to see that the man had met his end. As people who had witnessed the execution began to walk out, the crowd began to cheer. It said that they were shouting things like trick or treat and throwing candy at the anti-death penalty protesters who were there, which I feel like I shouldn't laugh at, but also I find funny. Today marks the 51st anniversary of this heinous crime, and yet we're still dealing with its after effects. Rumors about poisoned candy were a thing before this case and continued to be an even bigger fear afterwards. Of course, there are many statistics that tell us over the years that this is still a safe activity. I shared a lot more about those statistics in my past episode that I did 3 years ago, if you guys want to go and check that out. But despite the fact that we're told that there's not been a single case of a child having died after consuming contaminated Halloween treats, parents continue to worry for the simple fact that this is something that can happen, and for many, it has continued to put a damper on the activity as a whole. Unfortunately for Timothy O'Bryan, the scariest thing about his Halloween was his very own father. Ronald O'Bryan was the scariest kind of boogeyman, the kind that you never see coming. Hi. Some of you guys missed her last week. She is back this week. I think she was just sitting with my kids last week instead of being in here with me because I think I filmed when they were home. What were you doing last week? Or she was just not on camera. Sometimes she stays off camera. Okay. All right, say hello. Sit. Sit. Sit down. Sit.